Hi, I'm Colleen Thornton, your host for Quality Intelligence Food Safety. Today, we'll be talking to Jacob Minnich from Skidmore Sales in our third episode for this series on training, culture, and the risks and governance side of AI.
Food safety experts, for people who've actually been there, done that, been to lots of different places, seen lots of different things, maybe do some consulting, whatever, to make the jump from here's where we are now, here's how you take your specific situation, your specific risks, and implement them in a way that is livable, manageable, and not going to just kill you on adding more rules, more check boxes to your process.
Yeah, exactly. And there's 2 points that I want to make on that. The first point is going back to your systems and your processes, collecting data for the sake of data, or, structuring things just so that we can check the box. I'll give you a great example. So we just had our annual SQF refresher training at Skidmore, and I like to change up the questions for the quiz periodically because, they answer the same questions. They know what the answers are. And so I decided this time that I would make the questions a lot harder and we wouldn't score the quiz. So what I did was I made all of the questions like, where can you find information about the chemicals you're working with? And I said select, any of the apply. And they picked, everyone had all kinds of different answers. And I had all kinds of questions on there about, where they had to think about what the answer was. You give them the quiz up front. You give them access to the quiz up front, and then they have it when they go through the training. But then as they're reading the questions and they get to the slides where we talk about these things, they're looking at the questions and the answers, and they're saying, oh, well, okay, hang on. What's the right answer here? And the point of the quiz was not to have them select the right thing. It was to get them to think about it. And the way that I could tell that they thought about it was they were breaking down my door today, arguing with me about the quiz. And that's the point. And one of the great things about AI is that it allows you to take all of this information that you have. You have these long email threads, you have all these meeting notes, you have all these, to-do lists. Take them and throw them all in AI and start letting it organize the work that you do. And then from that, fail fast. As we integrate more and more technology into the work that we do, you got to think more like a tech company, which is continuously iterate, fail fast, figure out what doesn't work, and then you do something else. What we found that doesn't work is giving people quizzes for annual training where there's one correct answer. All of the answers on the sheet could be correct. What you want to do is...
So were you doing that in their phones, or was that on paper?
Both. I can do it on the phone, or I can do it on paper. Most of the people, oddly enough, opted for paper. And then they were not happy with the quiz because they had a lot of questions about it. And they said,
well, the fact that they're breaking down your door says that they are engaged, right? So yeah. Me as an auditor or a consultant, I'm looking at that going, how many people broke down your door today arguing about the quiz? Because to me, that is a performance measure of their engagement. If they didn't care, they'd walk off.
Well, and here's the other thing is that, some auditors are going to look at it and say, okay, well, what were the scores for the people, and what'd you do about it when they got the question wrong? Well, I won't have the scores because I'm not going to score these quizzes. But what I will do is look over them and see what kind of answers people had. And then I know if that comes up in an audit, that's going to be possibly a point of contention with an auditor to say, okay, well, you don't score the quiz. So how do you know that they actually got anything from the training? And then essentially it becomes a discussion. I like to tell people you should argue with your auditor.
I agree, actually. I actually agree. I want people to engage with me and tell me why what they're doing is correct.
Yeah.
Because if they can think and iterate why what they're doing is correct, then usually they are correct. If
Yeah.
they can't give me a why, it gets a little dicey.
Yeah. And, I 100% will challenge an auditor on this. If they say, well, how do you know these people learned anything if there's no score? I'll tell them, I'll give them the entire stack of quizzes and say, look through these and tell me if these people thought about their answers, if they understood it. Look at the questions. Do you think that
Right.
this is something where they're going to have to think about this, where they're going to actually be engaged? Yeah. I don't
Well,
think
and I
this
tell you, I don't know how many quizzes and trainings that I have reviewed where everybody got 100 on this quiz. You walk out to the floor and I'm writing nonconformances left and right because they really don't get it. And let's think about this a minute. Do we want the people who are good at taking tests constantly? Are they going to be always your best people to watch a machine and know when that sound is going like that, we got to get it stopped because we got to stop the line right now because we're going to have a big problem? Or that piece right there is not the right shape. Or there's a little extra debris over here. Or oh crap, sanitation forgot to disassemble that machine. Those are not things that people like who are that it's not congruitous with the same skill sets that we normally see with people who are really good at just taking a test.
Right. Exactly.
So, as far as I'm concerned, I want the people who are out there. So from a training perspective, when I'm looking at an auditor training, I'm like, okay, where are you having your training? Are you having it on the floor? Because most of the people that you have on the floor are kinetic learners. They are not paper. They're not audible. They're not they might be a little bit visual, but mostly they're not audible learners. So they're going to be hands-on learners. So where are you doing your training? Are you doing a scavenger hunt for risks? Are you doing, what kinds of things are you doing that make them physically show you, or in your case, you can see the process throughout your test and quizzes. You can see that they have to think about it, that they have to do something with that. And I think that's just that whole competency thing. A test does not make competency. I don't know how many tests I've taken that I'm not competent in.
I can tell you what's a good measure of competency. When I walk out on the floor and I'm walking around looking at things and people come up to me and they say, hey, I saw something that I think is a problem. And they'll point it out to me and they'll talk to me about it. That's a measure of competency. The people know their equipment. They know what the requirements are for food safety. They know what they have to do, and they know when something's wrong.
So are you tracking that for your, like you said, you have a QR code so they can do that on the QR code. And do you track that for your food safety culture?
So I put it in, all I do now is I put it in the SQF meeting notes. So I'll record. Okay. And what we do for food safety culture, we've tried a lot of different things. We've tried surveys, we've tried, lunch and learns. What seems to work the best is compensation. And that's not giving everybody a pay raise, but what it is you recognize when somebody does something, they do the right thing when no one's looking.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Right.
When somebody points out an issue to me, I'll put it in the SQF meeting notes, and we'll, as a management team, we'll say, okay, we think this person deserves a gift card because they obviously are paying attention to what's going on. They're not just here
exception-based, merit-based.
Yeah, they're not just here to collect a paycheck. They actually care about what they're doing, and we should reward them for that.
Yeah, I normally when I'm asking about the food safety culture programs, I'm asking, do you have reward programs for doing the right thing, for being engaged and doing something outstanding or showing something that would hurt the brand, that would be food safety related, that any of that kind of thing. And I also usually see that as two separate things, like. One, or like they make suggestions, right? One, did they make a suggestion? That's a notable engagement. Two, was that suggestion actually useful? And like, could you actually put it into place? Did you put it into place? If so, not only were they engaged enough to say something, they were engaged enough to say something that made a lot of sense and understood your processes, understood the costs and all of those things. And to me, that's two separate measurements, both of which can be used in KPIs or other things for food safety culture. So that's great. is there a way to, do you have any suggestions or any ways to use AI or things like that beyond the suggestion box QR code thing to do AI with food safety culture and how that can mesh?
I think probably the best thing that you can do, a simple one and a free one, would be setting up a chat bot with your procedures. And you can do this with Notebook LM.
Okay.
I could take all of Skidmore's SOPs and dump them all into Notebook LM. And then I can show the guys on the floor, and I can say, hey, if you have a question about procedure, you can just ask the chatbot. If I'm not around, you can ask the chatbot. Obviously, I want to talk to you, but you can just go to the chatbot and ask whatever question you want. And the really groundbreaking and amazing thing about large language models is that they don't keyword search. They can, but what they do is they do semantic search. So when you have words that are similar in meaning, they'll still be a match, even though they're not the same.
Interesting.
So when you're
never thought of that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's
so
a
when you're
great
talking
idea.
about, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I run into is that, even in audits, we have SOPs that are named something different than the standard. And so when an auditor says, I want to see your supplier approval SOP, is one that was a real pain in the butt for us for a long time, because our SOP was named approved suppliers, not supplier approval. And so, myself or our quality specialist would always search for supplier approval, and we couldn't find it. So, we eventually renamed it because it was just annoying. But that's one of the things.
Always a
That's
good idea.
that's a really simple example of, if it's in a chat bot, you just ask the chat bot and say, hey, I'm looking for the procedure where we do supplier approval. And it's going to say, okay, it's this procedure. It's not named the same thing, but it's the exact same meaning. I think the best example that I saw was that, cheese is related to mice and cheese is related to sandwiches, but sandwiches and mice are less closely related than cheese and mice. So
A plus B equals B equals C, but C doesn't necessarily equal A.
Yeah, well,
I will disagree with that when it comes to internal audit, but we'll go to that in another.
Well, it's not equals. It's about distance.
Okay.
So when you do
that makes sense.
So
right.
What these models do in order to do like a chatbot or something, what it does is it converts the text into what's called a vector. It's a numerical representation of a chunk of text, and then you can just run a plain old piece of code to compare one chunk of text, which is the question that you ask, against all the chunks of text that exist in your data set. And then it'll match the closest ones. And those are all based on semantic similarity. So a sandwich is more closely related to cheese, and a mouse is more closely related to cheese than a sandwich is related to a mouse. They're still related to each other, but not as close.
Right. Okay. So just a couple more questions I have for you. So opportunities and threats, you've talked just about some opportunities. What about the threats? And besides the hallucination, is there anything else that you would put in threats?
There's a lot of threats with AI. I think the biggest one is that you need to verify the outputs. I don't know if until you bring it under your own roof, it's hard to say that you can validate the outputs and you don't have to verify every individual one. You're going to want either you yourself or someone else needs to look at the result and see if it's right. It depends.
So somebody has to kind of know what's going on before the process.
Yeah, and obviously you want to risk.
You can't have somebody who doesn't have any knowledge of it.
Yeah, and you obviously want to risk assess it too, because some things, if you're giving it a very structured prompt and you're telling it to just compose a response based on, the data that you supply to it. If you give it an email and you say, give me the top 5 things out of this email, it will do that with probably 99.9% accuracy. The issues there are that it might leave something out, but it's not going to hallucinate something that you don't ask it when you provide all of the data. If you ask it for something and it's an open-ended kind of thing, that's when hallucination becomes a potential problem. Or
Or even
when
sourcing,
you ask
right?
it a
Like,
question,
so whether it goes to the right source.
say
So
again.
even sourcing, like what sources it
Oh, yeah.
uses, if like it may not go to all the right sources, or it may take a portion of the right sources or not the right sources or something of that nature.
Yeah, yeah. And open-ended or blind search is your biggest risk in that regard, and that's where you have to verify every output. And there's ways to
Okay, so
build
knowing what
there's
you're talking about.
yeah, well, and knowing how much information is in your data set that it's going to return, but you're just having it do the grunt work of going to get it and
Okay.
synthesizing it into a response. Um, that's what you want. You want to structure all of your data pipelines so that you know what it's going to fetch. And then if it fetches nothing, it's going to return nothing. You want to
Okay.
structure it in a way that it can't override your pipeline and default to the system response, which is probably some form of, you are a helpful assistant, always give a, positive and useful response. And a positive and useful
Okay.
response is going to be, I'm going to give them something because they asked for something. So that's one of the threats. The other threat is um, language models will repeat information that they're trained on. There's a big risk there. So one of the things that I saw, there's lots and lots of court cases going on right now with all these companies that run language models, and because they used basically stolen copies of copyrighted works to train the models. And they're saying it's fair use, and the people that are suing them are saying it's not fair use. The reason I bring that up is because the studies that have come out recently have essentially said that language models don't store the information that they're trained on. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. My understanding of it is that I can ask it to spit out the first, I don't know, 10 paragraphs from The Lord of the Rings. And it would do that for me if it doesn't have safeguards on it that prevent it from doing that. If it's been trained on The Lord of the Rings, it'll spit out the first 10 paragraphs, but it doesn't do it because that information is in the model. It does it based on math. So it can spit out
Interesting.
information. It can repeat information if it's been trained on it. It can usually repeat that information almost verbatim just on math. And the risk behind that is that if you're working with something like ChatGPT, or now Claude does it too, where they by default will train on your data to improve the model, there is a risk that it can spit that information back out to someone else if it's prompted properly. And that could be accidental or it could be intentional. A bad actor could be looking for your data and they could possibly get it from the model.
So there's an option for hacking through ChatGPT and Claude.
There's a whole separate type of hacking that's essentially prompt injection and, basically working over the model so that it disregards its safeguards and it'll spit out information that's not supposed to. And
But
this
there
is
are
why
safeguards that you
and
can
the,
put in
and
there.
well, and the model providers put a lot of safeguards on their models. Like they
Okay.
tell it that, in the system prompt is usually enormous. And some people are able to reverse engineer it and tell what it is, but it gets updated frequently. But the safeguards in the system prompt are typically things like, don't ever produce any harmful or abusive content, anything that could harm people, anything that is, pornographic in nature, anything that is threatening. And by prompting the model properly, you can get it to disregard those things. Where that's a real problem for food companies is that if you're dealing with proprietary data like customer information, formulations, anything like that, if you're using one of these models through anything except the API, where like if you're using it through the web interface, it's probably going to train on your data. And so you're giving it information that it could spit out to somebody else. And, there's also groups out there that are, marketing AI for food companies that they don't use They don't use the big providers. They don't use OpenAI. They don't use Claude, but they do train on your data. I would say avoid those companies because you don't want models that will train on your data where other customers are able to access the model through chat. If you can chat with the model, you can eventually get information out of it that it's not supposed to give you.
Okay, good to know. Okay.
So
Two more questions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to reiterate, you don't want to ever use a service that trains on your data. If you can avoid it, if you use a big provider, use the API. The API by default doesn't train on your data. You have to pay per submission, but it's very cheap. And then if you are going to use something that could potentially train on your data, anonymize your data. Make sure that you remove names, you remove anything that's identifying.
Interesting. Okay, good to know. All right, so two more questions, and then we can wrap it up. So the first one is, a few years ago, they were talking about the Internet of Things. Talk to me about that and how that works with this process.
So we don't see it a lot in food yet. I think the closest thing you're probably going to see is connected devices like, well, you'll see it with like temperature probes. You'll see it with some of these like automated forklifts or drones for doing inventory counts. You may eventually see it in the next few years with Tesla's Optimus robot that's doing warehouse work. Those are all things that are kind of the cutting edge of automation. Internet of Things isn't really all that big in food yet. And I can't really think of a way you would use it with AI.
Okay. What about 204 and traceability list?
From an AI perspective or a technology perspective?
And technology perspective. And frankly, I haven't seen one of my sites yet. And I go to a lot of sites. I haven't seen one yet that says that they're ready. Now, I know that some people say they are, but it's not the ones that I've been to. So talk to me about how you think AI and Internet of Things and the 204 process is likely to come together for the smaller and medium-sized companies.
Yeah, so the way I understand 204 is essentially the FDA is trying to get a better handle on traceability, down to the unit level and down to every entity in the supply chain. And you and I have talked about this before. I don't think that this is going to solve the problem. I think that until we actually have a industry searchable database of all of the production locations, I don't think that we're going to be able to really vet anyone. And that's what it really comes down to, is that you have to be able to vet your suppliers effectively. And what most people are doing, because we used to do it, is most people are just collecting the documents. And that's hard enough on its own. But collecting the documents is not doing your due diligence. Due diligence means you're looking at what the supplier gives you, and you're making an informed decision based on, the known or reasonably foreseeable hazards associated with that food and with the process that food's going through. And that was the intent of FSMA all along, was that, you conduct a hazard analysis. And at Skidmore, I call it the checklist of the checklist of FSMA, where basically the intent of FSMA is that you conduct your hazard analysis, and then you generate a checklist of all the hazards, and then you check off all the things that you've controlled. Whatever you haven't controlled, you pass the checklist on to your customer. And then they conduct their hazard analysis, and they do the same thing, and they incorporate the hazards that you notified them of. And that was the intent of FSMA, was that everyone was checking and everyone was knocking things off the list. And by the time it gets to the retail consumer, it's either controlled or it's declared on the label. So the consumer knows how to handle that food appropriately. And the problem that we're seeing, and I've seen this at pretty much every job that I've been to, doing supplier approval and talking to customers, everyone assumes that everyone's checking and no one's checking. And so, taking the time and having the resources to do that detailed, as much as you can, supplier assessment and understanding how they process the food, where the food comes from, what hazards it has, what could it have, how it's handled, transported, everything, So you know what you're getting. And so your customer knows what they're getting. If you can't do that, there's a big, huge gap in your food safety program. And I would say that gap exists in a lot of places.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it so many places that I go. They really struggle with the supplier program. A, getting the documents right, just even getting the documents to look at. B, having sufficient competency to even be able to look at what the supplier is doing, and is it right? Is there something I need to ask about? Depending on the number and the complexity of the item supplied, how does that work? And most of these software systems that they have for the supplier approval are really primarily document repositories. And granted, we need those because there's just so many documents, it gets ridiculous. And there's so many, FOBs, manufacturers, co-mans, distributors, brokers, you name it, involved in the supply chain, that it just gets really, really confusing and complicated really fast. But what we see frequently is people have a hard time getting the documents. Okay, number one, nobody's ever going to say that getting the documents is easy. If, however, something like TraceGains, they are getting documents, the question of actually reviewing them is something entirely different. Because we definitely see in my multiple audits, we just don't see people reviewing like they should. I'll pick 3 to 5 suppliers in a supplier set, and I'll go, okay, show me what you've done on these. And there's no evidence of review at all. Most often there are missing documents. Sometimes there's some pretty big oopses that come along with foreign supplier verification, or a lot of times with nuts, for instance, they won't have a validation process for 4 or 5 log reduction, depending on which type of nut it is and what the FDA is requesting. Most of those places have both raw nuts that are not processed or pasteurized and pasteurized going through the same facility. And how do you know that lot was actually done? So there's just because you have COA saying it's got a pathogen, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is actually been a pasteurization. So yeah, that's definitely a big thing. And Jacob, you have so much experience with this. I would love to get you on another time and just talk about supplier approval, what kinds of things can happen, the challenges, what kinds of things you've done to kind of make sure that your customers are getting the information that they need, especially as it relates to ready to eat and things like that, because we know that there's a lot of assumptions about what's ready to eat and what's not. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those assumptions are not good assumptions, and that they have controlled the pathogen, or that necessarily all of the foreseeable risks are controlled. So at some point in the near future, I'd love to get you back on for that. But in the meantime, absolutely. Are there any nuggets that you would like to leave everybody with to kind of close out?
Yeah. Two things. One was from earlier. I couldn't think of my second point, and I thought of it. But the first thing I want to talk about is about just getting the documents. And you and I have talked about this before, but I lay this issue at the feet of GFSI and at the FDA. This is really their fumble. I think the entire industry struggles with this, and it's because everybody wants to keep their cards close to the chest. But we're at the point now where the things that we're doing don't solve the recall problem. And it's because just getting the documents to do that review is so difficult, we don't have time for anything else. And I think that GFSI is large enough with enough companies having a certification that's tied to GFSI that we really need to, as an industry, we need to petition our certifiers and GFSI and say, look, if you're a GFSI company, you should be required to divulge some standard information about your product, about the food safety risks of your product. And that could be in the form of a checklist, it could be in the form of anything. But we can make this easier on ourselves by working together and pushing the standard to update and pushing the FDA to update, because the FDA is going about it from a, they want to clamp down on things. And I don't think that's going to solve anything. I think it's going to be, we need to push up on the FDA and say, look, this is how it needs to be solved. It takes us so long to get the stuff that we need to do our review that we can't do the review. And so, that's the first point. And the second point that I thought of earlier was, what I've seen in every role I've been in the food industry is that there's such a huge training gap and such a huge knowledge gap that, what's been really successful for Skidmore is bringing on a consultant to do our internal audits and to just generally keep us aware of what's happening in the industry. That's been really successful for us. And the other piece is just talking to our suppliers and our customers, talking to their quality people and saying, okay, what do you guys struggle with? What can we do better? How can we help you improve your quality? And, just sharing experiences. If you can share experiences, not from oh, you did this wrong, but from hey, are you sure that this is the right thing? Because it doesn't seem right. If we can all approach this in a collaborative fashion, I think that this gets a lot easier.
Agreed. And for full disclosure, I am the consultant for Skidmore. So, but yeah, and I didn't ask him to say that, by the way.
Well, we had a consultant before you.
That's right.
And even then, that was still very successful. It was far more successful than I've seen at other companies where we did it all internally. I can't be in other facilities, the bulk of the year. I can't be at conferences. I can't be doing all these things and do my regular job. So I can't have a pulse on the industry. I can't see what's happening other places. I don't know what kind of nonconformances are happening, elsewhere. Obviously you don't share all the information that you have because you're not allowed to. But, having any consultant that does anything outside of your facility is a second set of eyes that is going to be extremely beneficial for you. Because, your gaze is so narrowly focused on the job you're doing day in and day out that you're not going to be able to see things that someone else sees. And that's
it's almost like strategic versus tactile, right? So like,
yeah,
some people, we see all these other things that happen out in the industry, and we go, I wonder if that's happening here, or something triggers that, hey, wait a minute, this looks so similar to that, and that's not something you guys can see. So it goes from that strategic to tactical. And then on a consultant basis, obviously we can't consult during auditing, but on a consultant basis, we can say, oh, and by the way, here's the best practice that works for these folks that might work for you, and tweak that and provide insights that would give you're jumping faster you fail faster, but hopefully you're not failing at all with a consultant, right? So, but you're jumping faster to the successes that need to happen.
Yeah. And I would say that's probably
just asking the right questions too.
Yeah. And I would say that's probably the last point I'd want to make is that, even if you don't have a consultant, if you don't do anything else, push your auditor to talk about, what they see in the industry. Push them to talk about the best practices. Get information from them. They can't consult for you, but you can ask them and you can, badger them to say, well, what do you see other places? How do other people handle this? What type of things are problems elsewhere? What's the consensus on this? What do people think about this? What do you think about this? They'll answer you in some fashion if you badger them enough, but that's the purpose of having a SQF or BRC or any of those audits is that, it's supposed to make you better. And so get your money's worth. Push those people to talk about what they see.
Yeah, sports isn't going to necessarily get your money's worth. So if you can, and most auditors like to tell stories. So, so if you can do it without asking them to consult, because they won't consult, but if you can do it without asking them to consult, then you might be able to get nuggets of wisdom that you can use later down the road. So very good. Well, thank you very much, Jacob, for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. And there was so much there that could really give insight to a lot of folks. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time. And hopefully you'll be back sometime soon, because I'd really like to get some more information about some of your supplier approval challenges and successes. So I'd love to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute consulting, legal, or professional advice. We invite you to like, subscribe, and share. You can find more information and additional resources at heavensentfoodsafety.com. Join us next time for another episode of quality intelligence, food safety.